They said she was past her prime. Said the patients deserved someone faster, someone younger, someone whose hands didn't look like they'd been through too many winters. Dr. Marcus Webb put in writing, made it official, made it the kind of institutional truth that paperwork turns into fact. Eleanor Vasquez read the performance review on a Tuesday morning and did not cry. She had seen worse things than a performance review. She had held worse things in those slow hands of hers. She folded the paper once, neatly, and put it in the pocket of her cardigan. Then she went to check on Mr. Patterson in room 412, because his potassium had been trending low since Monday and nobody else had noticed. 3 days later, 8 Navy SEALs walked into Harborview Community Hospital in full dress uniform. They didn't go to the front desk. They didn't ask for directions. They walked directly to the geriatric ward on the 4th floor like men who had memorized the layout, which they had. They stopped in the corridor outside room 408. They stood in a line. And when Eleanor Vasquez came through the door of that room, cardigan, white hair, the slight careful walk of a 67-year-old woman who had been on her feet for 11 hours, the man at the front of the formation snapped to attention and raised his hand in a salute so precise, so absolute, so completely devoid of ceremony and full of meaning, that the 3 nurses watching from the station 30 feet away didn't understand what they were seeing. They would understand shortly. Eleanor would make sure of that. The geriatric ward at Harborview Community Hospital occupied the entire 4th floor of the building's east wing, a long corridor of rooms that smelled like lavender air freshener and institutional soap, and the particular complex smell of people at the far end of their lives. Eleanor Vasquez had worked this floor for 9 years. Before that, she had worked the surgical floor for 6 years. Before that, she had been a traveling nurse for 3 years, moving from hospital to hospital on short-term contracts, never staying long enough to accumulate the kind of institutional identity that made leaving difficult. And before all of that, before the nursing degree and the hospital badges and the comfortable shoes, she had been something else entirely, in a place entirely different from Seattle, Washington, in a heat so complete and so relentless that she still sometimes woke from sleep reaching for water. But that was not a story she told at work. That was not a story she told anywhere, really, except on the 2 occasions per year when the VFW Post in Ballard held its meetings and she sat in the back row and listened to men tell stories about themselves and said nothing about herself. She was not secretive about her service. She was simply private about it in the way that people are private about the things that cost them the most. You don't describe the price of a thing to people who didn't pay it. She arrived at the hospital at 6:30 every morning. Not because her shift started at 7, because the transition between night shift and day shift was always the moment when things fell through the cracks, when the tired night nurse handed off to the fresh day nurse, and the information that seemed important at 2 in the morning somehow didn't make it into the verbal summary, and the thing that didn't make it into the verbal summary became the thing that mattered at 9. Eleanor had learned this not in a nursing textbook, but in a field hospital in Quang Tri Province in 1971, where the transition between surgical teams happened under conditions that made nursing handoffs look luxurious, and where the information that fell through the crack was not a potassium level, but a shrapnel fragment that the outgoing team had missed in the dark. She signed in at the 6th floor nurses station. She always signed in at the floor above hers first, to check on the 2 patients she had transferred up last month and still thought about, and took the stairs down to 4. The corridor was quiet in the specific way of early morning hospital corridors, the overhead lights at their full harsh brightness, but the human activity not yet risen to match them. Carts in the hallway. A breakfast tray outside room 404. The sound of a television from somewhere turned low. Talia Rhodes was at the 4th floor station finishing her overnight charting. Talia was 28, 2 years out of nursing school, with the particular intensity of a young nurse who had decided this was the work she was meant to do and was still in the phase of discovery that comes before the phase of exhaustion. She looked up when Eleanor came through the stairwell door. "Morning, Eleanor," Talia said. 408 had a rough night. Mr. Kowalski was agitated around 3. We had to reorient him twice. He's settled now, but I wanted you to know before handoff. His sodium? Eleanor said. Talia looked at her screen. Running a little low. 131. That's why he was agitated, Eleanor said. She set her bag down behind the station and pulled up the medication record. The evening team increased his fluid intake yesterday because of his creatinine. Nobody flagged the sodium trend. She was already writing a note. I'll call Dr. Kim when she rounds at 8. He needs a repeat BMP, and we should hold the free water for now. Talia watched Eleanor write the note with the expression of someone taking a master class in something they had thought they already understood. How did you know to ask about the sodium? Talia said, because he's 81 and he's on a diuretic and his diet has been poor for 3 days, Eleanor said. Low sodium in elderly patients presents as agitation before it presents as anything measurable. The body tells you before the numbers do. She capped her pen. What else? They went through the board together. 12 rooms, 12 patients, the overnight summary that Eleanor absorbed the way she absorbed everything completely, with the attention of someone for whom incomplete information had once had consequences that nursing handoffs did not. By the time the day shift arrived at 7, Eleanor had already identified 3 things that needed attention before noon and had begun addressing the first one. This was why, despite everything Dr. Marcus Webb had written in his performance review, the 4th floor patients consistently had better outcomes than comparable wards in 3 other hospitals in the regional network. This was documented. It was in the data. Webb had chosen not to engage with the data. Dr. Marcus Webb had arrived at Harborview 18 months ago as the new Chief of Medical Staff Operations, a title that had not previously existed at the hospital and had been created specifically to bring in someone with Webb's particular skill set, which was the skill set of someone who had spent a decade in hospital administration consulting and knew how to read a cost-efficiency matrix and could say the phrase patient-centered operational excellence without his face doing anything ironic. He was 44 years old. He had a medical degree he had used for 3 years before deciding that clinical medicine was not his optimal lane. He was tall and well-dressed and spoke in the register of someone who had taken communication training and found it useful. He was not cruel, exactly. He was something more specifically damaging than cruel. He was a man who had learned to describe the removal of value as the optimization of resources and who had practiced this description so consistently that he had come to believe it himself. He first noticed Eleanor Vasquez the way he first noticed most things that represented inefficiency, as a data point. The geriatric ward supply costs were 11% above the network average. When he traced the variance, a significant portion of it connected to practice patterns on the 4th floor, specifically to a pattern of additional monitoring, additional lab orders, additional consultations that the attending physicians were generating in response to nursing flags that, in Webb's analysis, exceeded what the standard of care required. He pulled the nursing files. He found Eleanor's name attached to more of these flags than anyone else on the floor. He looked at her personnel record. 67 years old. 19 years with a hospital system. No formal disciplinary history. A handful of commendations that were the kind of vague institutional praise that accumulated over long tenures and meant less than nothing to a cost-efficiency matrix. He arranged to observe her during rounds 1, Wednesday morning. What he saw confirmed his preliminary assessment. Eleanor Vasquez moved slowly. She spent significantly more time in each room than the staffing model allocated. She asked patients questions that were not on the standard assessment checklist. She touched things, adjusted pillows, checked 4 sites with her fingers rather than just her eyes, held a patient's hand for 40 seconds while explaining a medication change. She was, by the metrics Webb had been hired to optimize, inefficient. He did not stay long enough to see what happened 2 hours later when the patient whose hand she had held for 40 seconds developed early signs of a pulmonary embolism that Eleanor had suspected during those 40 seconds. Suspected because of the way the woman's breathing had changed, a subtle shift that wasn't in the numbers yet, the body telling you before the data did. And Eleanor's early flag got the patient to imaging and then to intervention before the clot reached a size that would have made the outcome a different story. Webb scheduled the performance review for the following Tuesday. Eleanor received the review document on Tuesday morning at 8:15. She read it at the nurse's station while Talia was in room 411 doing vitals. The language was specific and carefully chosen, the kind of language that had been run through HR and legal before it arrived in her hands. Phrases like pace of care delivery inconsistent with unit demands and time management concerns relative to staffing model benchmarks, and recommend remediation plan with 30-day follow-up assessment. At the bottom, in a section labeled Additional Observations, Webb had written, given the physical demands of acute nursing care and the documented performance gaps outlined above, it may be appropriate to explore whether current role placement remains optimal for this staff member's capabilities at this stage of their career. Eleanor read that sentence twice. She had been in situations where people had underestimated what she was capable of. She had been in situations where the people who underestimated her had subsequently needed her to be capable of exactly that thing. She had learned, over 50 years of being underestimated in various configurations, that the correct response to underestimation was not argument. Argument required the other person to be reachable by words. Webb was not reachable by words. He was reachable only by evidence, and the evidence would present itself in its own time, the way evidence always did. She folded the review once. She put it in the pocket of her cardigan. She went to check on Mr. Patterson in room 412. His potassium was low. She had been watching it since Monday. She flagged it for Dr. Kim's morning rounds and wrote a specific, detailed note in the chart about the trend and her recommended response and the clinical reasoning behind the recommendation. Then she went to room 408 and checked on Mr. Kowalski, whose sodium was responding to the fluid restriction she had flagged at 6:30. Then she went to room 415 and sat for a moment with Mrs. Okafor, who was 91 years old and had been at Harborview for 3 weeks following a hip fracture and who did not have family in the city and whose face changed when Eleanor came into the room in the way that faces change when something reliable arrives. "How are we this morning, Mrs. Okafor?" Eleanor said. "Better now," the old woman said. Eleanor checked her vitals. She checked her surgical site. She asked about pain in the specific way. She asked about pain in elderly patients. Not, "Do you have pain?" but, "Show me on a scale from 1 to 10 where you are right now and tell me if it's different from yesterday," because elderly patients frequently minimize pain reports and the comparative question caught what the direct question missed. Mrs. Okafor said it was a 4. Yesterday, it had been a 2. Eleanor noted this. She adjusted the timing of the standing pain medication order to better cover the morning hours when Mrs. Okafor was most active. She documented the adjustment and her reasoning. She squeezed the old woman's hand before she left. In the hallway, Frank Simmons from Patient Coordination was waiting. Simmons was 53, 20 years in hospital administration, the kind of person who had learned to deliver institutional messages with the smooth detachment of someone who had personally uncoupled the messages from their meaning. "Eleanor," he said, "Dr. Webb would like to schedule a follow-up meeting regarding the performance review. His office is suggesting Thursday at 2. "Thursday at 2 is fine," Eleanor said. "He'd also like you to review the attached remediation plan template before the meeting," Simmons said. He held out a single sheet of paper. Eleanor took it. She looked at it briefly. The remediation plan template had fields for specific performance targets, timeline benchmarks, and supervisor sign-off dates. It was the kind of document that existed as both a corrective tool and a legal paper trail. "Thank you, Frank," she said. She folded the remediation template and put it in her pocket with the performance review. Her pocket was getting full of documents that described her as a problem to be solved. She had worn deeper pockets than this before. She went back to the station and continued her morning. Talia found her in the medication room at 11, preparing the noon medications for her section with the methodical precision she brought to everything. "Can I ask you something?" Talia said. "Yes," Eleanor said, without looking up from the medication cups. "I saw the performance review," Talia said. "Frank left a copy on the coordinator's desk, and I wasn't supposed to see it, but I did." A pause. "Eleanor, it's not right. You catch things nobody else catches. The Kowalski sodium this morning, the Patterson potassium, Mrs. Chin's aspiration risk last month. That was you." Every time, Eleanor lined up the medication cups in order of room number. She was aware that Talia was waiting for her to be upset or to validate Talia's upset on her behalf. She didn't have the energy for that kind of performance, and she didn't think it served anyone. "I know what I do," Eleanor said simply, "and I know what the review says. Those are two different documents. But aren't you going to?" I'm going to continue doing my job, Eleanor said, which right now means getting these medications to my patients on time. She picked up the tray. Mr. Kowalski's sodium is up to 134. That's a good morning. She carried the tray out of the medication room. Talia watched her go with the specific frustrated helplessness of someone watching an injustice proceed without adequate opposition. What Talia did not know, what nobody at Harborview Community Hospital knew, because Eleanor had not told anyone and the hospital's credentialing system showed only her nursing licenses and her continuing education credits and her 19 years of service, was that 3 days ago a phone call had been made. Not by Eleanor. Eleanor had not made the call. The call had been made by a man in San Diego who had received a letter forwarded through a veterans network he had been part of for 12 years, and who had read the letter and then picked up his phone and called a number in Virginia. Eleanor did not know about the call yet. She would find out on Friday. Thursday's meeting with Webb was in his office on the second floor, a corner room with a view of the hospital's parking structure and a desk that was very clean in the way of desks whose owners spent most of their time in meetings rather than at them. Webb sat behind it with the remediation plan template open on his computer and the performance review in a manila folder in front of him. Simmons was present as a witness, sitting in the chair by the window with a legal pad. Eleanor sat across from Webb in the chair that had been positioned slightly lower than his desk level, which was either intentional or coincidental, and in either case told her something about the room. "Thank you for coming in, Eleanor," Webb said. He had a particular smile for these situations, the smile of someone performing reasonableness. "I want to start by saying that this conversation is meant to be supportive. We value your experience and your institutional knowledge, and this remediation process is designed to help you succeed in your current role." "I understand," Eleanor said. "The benchmarks I've outlined in the plan," he turned the computer screen slightly toward her, "are based on network-wide staffing model data. The expectation is that by the 30-day review point, your time per patient metrics will be within 15% of the unit average. If I spend 15% less time per patient," Eleanor said, "I will catch fewer things." Webb maintained his expression. "The staffing model accounts for appropriate clinical assessment time. The staffing model was built on average acuity data," Eleanor said. "The fourth floor population is above average acuity. The model doesn't account for that. Our data shows the fourth floor performs within normal acuity ranges." "Your data measures acuity at admission," Eleanor said. "My patient's acuity changes between assessments. That's the nature of geriatric care. The risk window is in the change, not the baseline." She looked at him steadily. "I flagged 7 early deteriorations in the past 90 days. 5 of them became significant clinical events that required intervention. 2 didn't because they were caught early enough. The time I spend per patient is why those flags happen when they do." Webb was quiet for a moment. He had a specific way of being quiet that involved looking at his folder, which he did now. "I appreciate the clinical context," he said, "but the performance targets are set at the system level, and my role is to ensure alignment across the unit." He looked up. "I want to be honest with you, Eleanor. The hospital is also looking at overall staffing structure for the coming fiscal year, and positions that are not performing within model parameters are going to face additional scrutiny." "Understand," Eleanor said again. She signed the remediation plan acknowledgement form. She did not sign it as agreement. She signed it as acknowledgement that she had received it, which was what the form required. She knew the difference. She had spent 50 years knowing the difference between what a document meant and what it said. She walked back to the 4th floor and spent the rest of her shift doing her job. That evening, she drove home to her apartment in the Finney Ridge neighborhood, a small, orderly apartment she had lived in for 14 years, with a garden she tended on weekends and a bookshelf full of medical texts she still read and one photograph on the kitchen wall that she had looked at every morning for 52 years. The photograph showed a group of people in green fatigues standing in front of a military tent in a landscape of dense vegetation and red dirt. They were young in the photograph. Impossibly young. Eleanor stood in her kitchen and made tea and looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she went to bed. Friday arrived without ceremony. Eleanor was on the floor at 6:30. She reviewed the overnight board. She flagged 2 things. Mrs. Okafor's blood pressure was trending higher than baseline, and room 417 had a new patient from the overnight, a 78-year-old man with poorly controlled diabetes whose admission glucose was 340 and whose care plan she had specific questions about. She documented both flags and began her morning routine. At 9:15, Talia appeared at the station with an expression that Eleanor had not seen on her before. Not the frustrated helplessness of Thursday. Something different, something closer to bewildered. "There are people downstairs," Talia said. "There are always people downstairs," Eleanor said. "Military people," Talia said. "In uniform. They asked for the 4th floor. They asked for you by name." A pause. "Eleanor, they asked for you by a different name." Eleanor was writing in a chart. She stopped writing. "What name?" she said. "Echo," Talia said. "They asked for Echo." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at the wall for a moment. Not at anything on it, just at the wall itself, the way you look at a fixed point when you're reorganizing something internal. "Tell them I'll be down in 5 minutes," she said. She finished the note she had been writing. She completed it fully, with the clinical detail it required, because a partial note in a patient chart was a gap in the record, and gaps in the record had consequences. Then she capped her pen, straightened her cardigan, and took the elevator to the lobby. They were in the lobby when she stepped off the elevator. 8 of them, in navy dress uniforms. The dark blue, the gold, the ribbons, and insignia that Eleanor could read the way civilians read plain language. She read the rank at a glance, the decorations at a glance, the specific bearing of each man in the formation, and what it told her about how long they'd been doing what they did. At the front of the formation stood a man of approximately 40, with the compact, weathered build of someone who had spent 2 decades in environments that tested physical endurance as a matter of course. His name, tape, read Calloway. His rank was Master Chief Petty Officer, and on his chest, among the ribbon rows that told the story of 20 years of service in compressed visual language, was a set of insignia that Eleanor recognized the way you recognize things you have not seen in 50 years but never forgot. She walked toward him across the lobby. The lobby was populated with the usual mid-morning hospital traffic, visitors, staff coming off shift, a family grouped around a man in a wheelchair, a woman at the information desk. All of them had noticed the 8 men in uniform. All of them had stopped doing whatever they were doing to watch. Eleanor stopped 3 feet from Calloway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had the eyes of someone who had been briefed on this moment, but was also experiencing something that no briefing could fully prepare you for. "Eleanor Vasquez," he said. "Yes," she said. "Hospital Corpsman Eleanor Vasquez," he said. "United States Navy, attached to 3rd Marine Division, 1st Marine Regiment, Republic of Vietnam, 1970 to 1972. The lobby was very quiet. "That's a long time ago," Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am," Calloway said. "It is." He snapped to attention. His right hand came up in a salute with the precision of a man who had been doing this for 20 years and meant it with every repetition, but had never meant it more than he meant it now. Behind him, in a single unified motion, the 7 other SEALs came to attention and raised their hands. Eleanor stood in the lobby of Harborview Community Hospital in her cardigan and her comfortable shoes with her white hair and her 67 years, and she looked at 8 Navy SEALs saluting her in the way that the sea salutes the shore, completely, without reservation, with the full force of everything behind it. She raised her right hand and returned the salute. The family by the wheelchair was crying. Eleanor would notice this later. At the moment, she noticed very little outside the formation in front of her and the weight of what was being said without words. Calloway lowered his salute. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. He held it out. "From Admiral Raymond Cole," Calloway said. "United States Navy, retired." He wanted it hand-delivered. A pause. "He said to tell you that he's been looking for you for a long time. He said to tell you that the Navy does not forget its corpsmen." Eleanor took the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. She did not open it in the lobby. "Your father?" she said to Calloway, reading something in the shape of his face, the way a face carries forward what was given to it. Calloway looked at her steadily. "Thomas Calloway," he said. "Lance Corporal, 1st Marines. Quang Tri Province, November 1971. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He made it home," she said. It was not a question. She knew he had made it home. That was the point of what she had done in Quang Tri Province in November 1971. That was the entire point. "He made it home," Calloway confirmed. His voice had changed quality, still controlled, still professional, but carrying something underneath the control that he had brought with him from San Diego across 1,500 miles to say in person. He lived to be 78 years old. He had 3 kids and 7 grandchildren and a vegetable garden in Escondido that my mother said was the most important thing in his life, after us. He paused. "He talked about you. Not often, not in detail, but enough. He called you the one who stayed. He said everyone else cleared out when the fire got bad. You stayed." Eleanor looked at the envelope in her hands. "He was bleeding out," she said simply. "Someone had to stay. He told me," Calloway said, "that you were talking to him the whole time. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't feel much, but he could hear your voice. He said you talked to him for 40 minutes straight while you worked on him. You told him about Seattle. What it looked like. The water and the mountains. He said he'd never been to Seattle." A pause. "He moved to Escondido, not Seattle. But he talked about Seattle for the rest of his life." Eleanor looked at the lobby, at the polished floor, the information desk, the family by the wheelchair who were still crying, the nurses and staff who had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by whatever gravity had accumulated in the lobby in the past 4 minutes. And then, because she was aware that the lobby of a hospital was not the place for the magnitude of what she was feeling, she straightened her cardigan. She was a woman who had learned that dignity was not the suppression of feeling, but the choice of where to put it. "Thank you for coming," she said to Calloway. "Thank you for all of you coming." She looked at the formation. "Your country is lucky to have you." "It was lucky to have you first, ma'am," Calloway said. Webb had been in the lobby. This was not by design. He had been crossing the lobby on his way from the parking structure to his office when the formation had assembled, and he had stopped, as everyone had stopped, because 8 Navy SEALs saluting an elderly woman in a cardigan was not something you walked past without stopping. He had stayed for the entire exchange. He had heard the name Thomas Calloway. He had heard Quang Tri Province, November 1971. He had watched Eleanor return the salute with the specific quality of someone who had earned it in a way that made the gesture something other than ceremony. He went to his office. He sat at his clean desk. He opened his computer. He pulled Eleanor's personnel file. He looked at it for a long time, looked at the fields that said previous military service, United States Navy, 1969 to 1973. A field he had looked at before and had processed as background information, the way you process background information when you're looking for something specific, and it is not the something specific you're looking for. He opened a separate search. He typed, Hospital Corpsman Vietnam Quang Tri Province 1971. He read for 40 minutes. Then he called Simmons. Frank, he said, the remediation plan for Eleanor Vasquez. I need to put a hold on it. Simmons was quiet for a moment. The 30-day review is scheduled for her. Put a hold on it, Webb said. He looked at his computer screen. And pull her full service record. The military section. I want to see what's in it. He ended the call. He sat at his desk and thought about the phrase time per patient metrics and what it measured and what it did not measure and the specific distance between those two things. Eleanor spent the rest of Friday doing her job. She was in room 415 with Mrs. Okafor at 2 in the afternoon when Talia appeared in the doorway with the expression she'd had in the lobby, the bewildered one, upgraded. Webb's assistant called. Talia said, the remediation plan is on hold. Eleanor was checking Mrs. Okafor's blood pressure. Still trending up, she was going to flag it again for the evening team, make sure they had eyes on it. She noted the reading. All right, she said. Eleanor, Talia said. Who was that man? In the lobby. Eleanor put the blood pressure cuff away. She looked at Mrs. Okafor, who was watching her with the interested attention of a very old woman who has learned that the most interesting stories arrive without announcement. His father was a Marine, Eleanor said. A long time ago. And you knew him? Talia said. For about 40 minutes, Eleanor said. In a very specific set of circumstances. She squeezed Mrs. Okafor's hand. The old woman's blood pressure was 152/88. Higher than it should be. Eleanor would flag it. She would write a specific, detailed note about the trend. She would make sure the evening team had it. "Will you tell me?" Talia said. Eleanor looked at her. 28 years old, 2 years out of nursing school, with the intensity of someone still in the phase of discovery. The same age Eleanor had been when she went to Vietnam. Younger, actually. Sometime, Eleanor said, "Not today. Today I have 2 more flags to write before handoff and Mrs. Okafor's blood pressure to monitor." She stood. "Go check on Mr. Kowalski. His sodium has been good for 3 days. Let's make sure it stays good." Talia went to check on Mr. Kowalski. Eleanor went to the station and opened the chart for Mrs. Okafor and began to write. The envelope from Admiral Raymond Cole, retired, United States Navy, 4 stars, 32 years of service, former commander of Naval Medical Forces Pacific, contained 3 things. The first was a letter. It was 2 pages, handwritten, which Eleanor had not expected. Admirals did not generally write things by hand. This one had. The handwriting was precise and somewhat formal. The handwriting of a man who had been trained to write clearly and had maintained the habit. The letter described, in the specific language of someone who had spent a career choosing words carefully, what Eleanor's service in Vietnam had meant in terms of the Navy had not formally acknowledged at the time because the circumstances of certain operations in Quang Tri Province in 1970 to 1972 had not been formally acknowledged either. It said, "We were wrong not to find you sooner. We were wrong in many things about that period, but the specific wrong of not finding the people who held the line while others left is one I have spent 30 years trying to partially correct." It said, "Thomas Calloway told his son about you before he died. His son is the kind of man Thomas was, and I know Thomas because we served together in 1968 before Quang Tri, before all of it. When James Calloway called me 3 days ago, I understood immediately what needed to happen." It said, "You deserve better from your country than it gave you. I cannot correct the past 50 years. I can only make sure that what you did is on the record, correctly, in language commensurate with what it cost." The second thing in the envelope was a citation. It was printed on official Navy letterhead, with Admiral Cole's signature and the seal of the United States Navy. It described specific actions in Quang Tri Province on 3 specific dates in 1971 and 1972, in language that was precise and formal, and that made Eleanor, reading it alone in her kitchen on Friday evening, set it down on the table and sit with her hands flat for a long moment before she could pick it up again. The third thing was a medal. A specific medal, in a specific case, for specific actions, 52 years late. Eleanor held it in her hand for a while. It was lighter than she remembered medals being from the time she had seen them up close. Or perhaps she was thinking of other things that had weight. She put the medal in its case and set it on the kitchen table next to the citation and the letter. She looked at the photograph on the wall, the one from the green fatigues and the red dirt and the impossible youth of everyone in it. She made tea. She sat at the table and drank it and looked at the things Admiral Cole had sent her and thought about Thomas Calloway and his vegetable garden in Escondido and his son who had come 1,500 miles to deliver an envelope and 8 men who had stood at attention in the lobby of a hospital in Seattle and a 36-year-old woman she had been in a place she had tried for 50 years to describe accurately to herself and had never quite managed. 40 minutes, Thomas Calloway had said. She had talked to him for 40 minutes. She didn't remember what she had said about Seattle. She remembered the blood and the specific quality of the light in Quang Tri Province in November and the sound of fire that hadn't stopped and the decision she had made, which was not really a decision. It was more like the recognition of what was already true, which was that she was staying because someone had to and because he was breathing and because as long as he was breathing, the math of the situation required her to be there. She finished her tea. She went to bed. She would be at the hospital at 6:30. There was a blood pressure trend in room 415 that needed watching and a new patient in 417 whose diabetes management needed a closer look and a potassium level in room 412 that she wanted to see before morning rounds. The work was there. It was always there. It was the most reliable thing she knew. On Monday, Webb appeared on the 4th floor at 9 o'clock. This was unusual. Webb's administrative orbit rarely brought him to the patient floors before noon. Eleanor was in room 411 when he arrived, performing a wound assessment on a post-surgical patient with the focused attention she brought to wound assessments, which was the same attention she brought to everything. He waited in the hallway. When she came out, he was there. "Eleanor," he said. He did not have the specific smile this time. He had a different expression, one she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has read something that has reorganized what he thought he knew about a situation. "Dr. Webb," she said, "I wanted to speak with you about the remediation plan," he said. "I understand it's on hold," she said. "It's not just on hold," he said. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I've been reviewing the outcome data from the 4th floor, specifically the early deterioration flags and the clinical events that followed from them." He paused. "The data supports your clinical approach. I should have looked at it earlier and I didn't, and that was a mistake in my analytical framework." Eleanor looked at him. He was a man who was not practiced in this kind of statement and was making it anyway, which she gave him credit for. "The remediation plan will be withdrawn," he said. "Formally withdrawn, not suspended. And I'd like to schedule time with you to understand how the early flag system you've developed might be standardized across the floor. The methodology you're using, identifying the trend before it shows in the numbers. That's not something the staffing model currently accounts for." "No," Eleanor said. "It isn't. Would you be willing to help us build that in?" he said. Eleanor considered this. She thought about what it would require and what it would produce and whether the production was worth the requirement. "Yes," she said, "but I need protected time to do it properly. You can't ask me to document a clinical methodology on top of my patient load." "Agreed," Webb said, without hesitation. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment. The hand of a man who had called her slow, called her past her prime, put it in writing and made it official. And then she shook it because the work of the future was more important than the accounting of the past. "I'll be in room 415 for the next 20 minutes, she said. "Mrs. Okafor's blood pressure has been running high, and I want to be with her when the resident reviews the trend this morning." "Of course," Webb said. She went into room 415. Mrs. Okafor was awake, looking out the window at the Seattle morning. The gray sky and the distant water and the mountains that appeared occasionally between the clouds like a rumor of something permanent. The blood pressure monitor beside her bed showed 148/82. Down from Friday. Moving in the right direction. "Good morning, Mrs. Okafor," Eleanor said. "Better now," the old woman said. Eleanor pulled up the monitoring chart. She looked at the trend. Down 4 points systolic from Friday. Not enough yet, but moving. The body telling you before the numbers do, and the numbers beginning to agree. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She had a few minutes before the resident came. "Were those men here for you?" Mrs. Okafor said. "On Friday. The soldiers." "They were," Eleanor said. "I thought so," the old woman said. She looked at Eleanor with the specific perception of someone who had been alive long enough to recognize things that younger people missed. "You look like you knew them. Or they knew you." "Something in between," Eleanor said. "It was a long time ago." "Long time ago doesn't mean gone," Mrs. Okafor said. "Long time ago just means you carried it far." Eleanor looked at the blood pressure monitor. 148/82. She wrote it down. "How's your pain this morning?" she said. "On a scale from 1 to 10, compared to yesterday." 3, Mrs. Okafor said. "Better than yesterday." "Good," Eleanor said. She stayed until the resident arrived. She went through the blood pressure trend in clinical detail, walked through her recommended adjustment to the antihypertensive dosing, explained her reasoning with the specificity that residents needed to understand not just what to do, but why. The resident listened and asked 2 good questions, which Eleanor answered fully. Then she went to the next room, and the next. The corridor was bright and smelled like lavender and institutional soap and the complex, necessary smell of people working very hard to stay alive. Eleanor Vasquez moved through it the way she moved through everything, steadily, with full attention, with the specific patience of someone who understood that the important information was always in the trend, that you had to watch long enough and closely enough to see the direction of change, and that the direction of change was the only thing that told you where you were actually going. She had learned this in places she did not describe to people who hadn't been there. She carried it in her hands every day. If Eleanor's story reminded you that the people who carry the most are often the ones who speak about it the least, hit that like button and share this with someone who should hear it. Subscribe for more stories about the hidden heroes walking among us every day. And drop a comment. Have you ever met someone who turned out to be carrying something like this?